I'm tremendously pleased to be here with you and bring you greetings from the church on the very most southern tip of Texas, where the faith is the root of the lives of so many people who are facing challenges, not only the challenges that you are facing here in the issue of evangelization. I'm happy to be here to share a few thoughts with you, a few experiences that I think might help us to focus our reflections on the work of the church as an engine of evangelization, and that might in some way maybe stir some reflection personally within ourselves, within yourselves, in terms of how to apply some of the things that I speak about. In some sense, what I talk about this afternoon briefly is perhaps as important the questions I pose as to kind of the answers that I might sort of intimate. I want to speak a little bit about Parish as an evangelizing reality, which I think is part of what is very much at the heart of the new evangelization. And I would like to ask us to ask ourselves, what kind of a parish am I in, and how can I be an agent of the kind of energy that the church is calling for and that the Spirit is calling for? A parish that actually reflects something of the life that Christ offers as the teacher of the way that leads to the Father. It is a community that actually enjoys serving others. It enjoys dealing with people. It's a parish, it's a community of believers who relish the idea that, and the opportunity to serve something other than itself. It's not just self-maintaining, because sometimes we can fall into that in all institutions, this sense that we are sort of here to kind of keep the thing operating. But rather serve something and an issue and a concern, a mission, others really, other people outside of our own boundaries. And really, it must be a community that knows how to pray. Not just at Sunday Mass, but in a lot of different other contexts, the context of prayer. I think it's important to remember that one of the most frequently sort of signaled questions that Jesus received in the gospel is, Lord, teach us how to pray. And in some way, I think one of the challenges before us is how is it that we learn how to pray, and how is it that we invite others to know what prayer is about? I was ordained during the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, and I was particularly stirred by his invitation to us all. I was made a bishop during the pontificate of Benedict XVI. And here we are, gathered during the initial phase of the pontificate of Pope Francis. I want to just say a little bit about that. I think it's important for us in the church to renew our sense of the providence of God and of his concern, and to remember something that Chesterton said, that the church is not like a placid vehicle or a moored boat. It's like a chariot that swerves through history under the sort of the surprising movements of God, precisely to deal with the very dynamic and in some ways unpredictable challenges that we face. I would say that as a young man entering the seminary in the time of the time of John Paul II, if I were to summarize what I heard when I was 18 or 19 years old from the Holy Father, it was, to the church, stop whining and do something to create a civilization of love. Sometimes we do get kind of whiny about how things aren't right and things aren't the way we want them to be and how come we don't do it this way, and do something to create a civilization of love. The emphasis that I heard, and I still hear echoing in the words of now Blessed John Paul II, is we have a challenge in our time to create a civilization of love. When I was being called to the episcopacy under the pontificate of Benedict, I read and still read what he wrote about love. And if I were to summarize it's dangerous to summarize the Holy Fathers, but I'll try. Pope Benedict was saying things like, we need to start thinking about what real love is really about, because one of the issues in our modern culture is that it has gotten very confused And the full splendor of what Christian love in the gospel has somehow gotten eclipsed, or it needs to be represented in a clearer way, because we're letting other people define Christian love for us, as opposed to us being the agents by which Christian love is discovered anew. Because Benedict, I think, in a very real sense, was saying we need to think about what real love is about, because only love can change things. Only love can change things. I think this is kind of the theme that runs throughout his marvelously written encyclicals. And now we're in the time of Pope Francis. We must see these things as moments in the providence of God. Because Pope Francis has a different style. I'll talk about this. The chariot does swerve. But that is God's business. And ours is to kind of be attentive as to what in everything he says and everything he does, Pope Francis is saying, this is what love has to do. Because it is what the world desperately needs. It is what redeems. It is what saves. It is what we announce. It is what we evangelize by means of love. Love not as the world finds it for us, but love as the gospel starkly and dramatically places it before us in the person of Christ and in what Christ himself exemplifies in every action and every word. Love is a sacrifice. It thinks of the other before it thinks of itself, and it brings joy. The three things, I think, that all three of these pontificates in our time have been saying to us, but in a certain crystallized way. It is a sacrifice. It thinks of the other first, and it brings joy. It is what redeems, and it is the object of our evangelization. And all this builds upon John Paul speaking to us about a civilization of love. Francis is echoing that strongly. Benedict speaking to us about the fact that only love can change things. And Francis showing us, because the object of our proclamation is Christ, who is the incarnate love of the Father. We must be convinced of this, that in our current context, the papal magisterium is consistently telling us that in a certain way, to evangelize, we have to show love first. And then we can speak about why we believe in it. In other words, love becomes the principal work of the church to call attention to the new way of life that Christ Jesus teaches us. Perhaps in another age, the primary question that people were asking is, what is true? After all, that is what Pontius Pilate asked the Lord, what is the truth? But I think the modern magisterium is telling us that the world, the modern Pontius Pilate is asking the church, and what is love? In a taunting way. Because the whole history of the modern era could be summarized in saying that it's been a reconfiguration of what the human heart thinks love is about. The gospel always presents the love of God in its pure and dramatic emphasis on dramatic. It does something. It changes things, Benedict said. That is the time we're living in. So when I speak about an evangelizing community, and this could apply to a parish, this could apply to an apostolic movement, it could apply to a number of things, I'm going to emphasize the importance of us focusing on the content of Christian love. I agree with those who say that many think today Jesus is a nice guy. I also think it's true that there's a great world out there that thinks the only thing Jesus ever said was have a nice day. And in a certain sense, our mission, if we want to kind of focus on it, it is a mission to not just speak about it, that is what Christian love is, but to actually exemplify it. In a certain way, we have to ask, and always go back to the root of the gospel itself, what did Jesus come to do? I'd like to spend a little time on this. Because there we will find sort of revealed a certain sense of what the how looks like when it comes to manifesting the love of Christ, because the love of Christ is what invites faith in him. And the church is the instrument by which the love of Christ is manifested in the world. Not to the world in general, but to the person next door, or the person across the street, who lives across the street from the church but never goes into it. Love can make a difference. That is what Benedict had said, what John Paul was asking us to focus upon and stop thinking about our internal conflicts and disputes, and what Francis is asking us today. Very good then. What did Jesus come to do? God came down from heaven. That is the point of the faith. And when you read the Gospels and kind of see the broad outline of what it is that the Lord, as the Gospel unfolds, and it is an unfolding, I think we could summarize it, or I will try, in kind of certain moments of what Jesus does, because this is reflective, I think, and important for us, because we have to mirror this in some way. Jesus, first of all, draws people's attention. Secondly, Jesus frees people. Jesus teaches. Once he has their attention, he begins to teach them. His object is to turn a crowd into a community. Remember, the Gospels always said, and then the crowd approached him, but he called them, and he got their attention. And then he began to teach them, which is the forming work of Christ. Jesus draws, Jesus frees, Jesus teaches, Jesus always feeds. You read the Gospels. And then Jesus sends. Now, I think this is sufficiently rooted in the whole unfolding of all four Gospels to get a sense that we like to speak of programs. Jesus didn't have a program. Jesus simply did the will of the Father, moved by the Holy Spirit. That was his mission. But the reality is that we can detect these moments. And I would like to suggest to you that these are the moments that we live intensely every time we go to Mass. Because the fact that by whatever providence, the fact is that when people walk through the door, Jesus has called, they have been attracted to him somehow. Jesus draws people. And when we read the Gospels and we hear the sermon and we kind of reflect upon the readings, Jesus teaches people. And we go into the Eucharistic sacrifice, which is the culmination of the whole act of feeding. Jesus fed throughout the Gospels in many, many different ways, but the fundamental and highest act was the Last Supper, from which all others were a reflection. Jesus feeds people. But lest we forget the very importance of the very closing of the Mass, and he sends people. Go forth. You see, these four things that we live intensely every time we go to Mass. Now, I'm talking to, I'm confident, and I'm absolutely sure, regular Mass goers. So you see the reflection between what the Gospel has. This is not just happenstance and coincidence. This is the deep sense of the rhythm of revelation, the rhythm of salvation, the things Jesus does, or what the Church does most intensely in her sacrifice of the Eucharist, which is what feeds us. But to everyone in this room who have been called by Christ, who have been taught by Christ, who have been fed by Christ, must be conscious of how it is that we are sent by Christ, because that's the fourth moment of the Mass, and it is the fourth moment of the mission of the Son. The people are not fully formed until they recognize that there is a call to go out. That's the difference between saying Jesus came simply to save, once saved, always saved, and Jesus came to transform, because we are transformed into a people who go out and then begin to invite others to come. Now, the Mass is the highest expression of this, but I would like to suggest that in our activities in communities, our activities in parishes, we have to use this as the measuring rod of all the other activities. But let's focus a little bit on why people came to Jesus. It was an important theological question for the fathers of the Church, why Jesus didn't live like John the Baptist. Why didn't he go off into the desert? And the answer they gave was a very simple and very profound one, because he wanted to be accessible to people. He wanted to be where people were. He had a different mission than John the Baptist. In a certain way, the whole way Jesus expressed himself was he went out amongst the people, and they came to him precisely because they saw that he was someone who loved life. He was an embracer of life, especially life that was broken, life that was excluded, life that was of no value to the powers of the world. That is what drew people to him. In a word, they were drawn to him by his goodness. The miracles were signs, but he didn't cure everybody. His main object was to be amongst the people so they would have an accessibility to his goodness. They were attracted to his goodness. I think we have to keep this in mind, that the object of the church's formation, of those who participate regularly in the sacrifice of the Mass, who receive the nourishment that comes from the gospel and the Eucharist, and who then go out and are sent, we are sent to be amongst, we are sent to be where people are. But let us be aware that Jesus was particularly anxious to be where people were that were otherwise not accepted. In the very real sense, we are called to have a special place in our hearts for prisons, for nursing homes, for hospitals, for detention centers, all those places where people, for one reason or another, feel like they've been relegated to the side. Because the way Jesus preached the gospel, he preached to the periphery that would eventually convert the interior. They were the ones most anxious to hear a news that they were being invited back into a belonging again. One of the questions we have to ask in our current context about the current evangelization is exactly who is it in our culture today that feels they don't belong anywhere? Because if we're going to be a people sent after the model of Jesus, because, I repeat, we have been called by him, we have been taught by him, we have been fed by him, and we have been sent by him, then we go out every day in some way and we touch a periphery that nobody else seems to think is all that important. We have, the eye of a Christian is the eye that looks at the edge to see who's standing by the side of the wall and maybe doesn't feel they can sit down with everybody else. And the eye of a parishioner at a Sunday Mass doesn't just look to see, oh, who's sitting in the pew two up from me because they're huggers and I'm not. Let's be real, all right? But it has an eye rather to say, oh, who's not here? In a certain way, the whole purpose of the new evangelization is to transform the eyes of the person in the pew to notice who's not here and why. Why not? Maybe they got sick. A lot of people stop coming to Mass, not so much because they stop believing, because they stop thinking it matters. In that sense, I think we have a special responsibility. We speak sometimes in the church of the preferential option for the poor. I would like to phrase it differently in terms of the new evangelization. A preferential option for those who think they have no access. There are lots of people in our neighborhoods and on the peripheries of our parishes who maybe come once in a while, who think they have no access. Access to what, you ask? Well, access to any sort of belonging where it seems to be that things are happening. And in a certain way, and I say this particularly to the clergy, priests, deacons, religious also, that we have a responsibility to have a preferential option for those who think they have no access to us. Because, oh, Father, you're very busy. I know, Father, you're very busy, but can you hear my confession? I've been asked that so many times. I say, if I'm too busy to hear a confession, then I need to pack up and give it up. Because some things are what we're all about. I would suggest, therefore, that this becomes kind of the sense of what the engine of the Eucharist is meant to do for us. It's meant to make us a people who have a transformed vision as to who, like I say, is not here, and how do we find them. Now, I know sometimes we fall back into certain patterns. We all do this. Sometimes we get this sense that, okay, we want to plan a new evangelization here in the parish, and so let's call a meeting. And then we're disappointed because only 10 people showed up, right? We did it at all the announcements. Father even said something at the announcements, and it makes a big difference. I know this. People say, Bishop, if you just write a letter, we'll get people to come. I said, oh, you have much more confidence in my letters than I do. It doesn't, cartas hasta el copete, we say. I can write letters up to the top of my head, right? But unless somebody knows somebody and invites them to get there, very little difference. The gospel has always been about, Jesus has always been about people who know people. Letters, they have a place in that. People who know people, but that's what really, and so actually, if we're going to follow the model that's in the gospel, I suggest, no, when Jesus was going to feed the crowds, he didn't like depart and then set out a notice, and by the way, we're going to have a luncheon, you're invited to come. He said, divide them up in groups and feed them yourselves. Now, I am not proposing this as a paradigmatic way to do things, but what would happen if in a parish, at a certain moment at the conclusion of the Mass, Father said, now I'm going to divide you up in groups. And I want you to talk about what each of you can do this week to reach out to somebody who's not here. Because this is not the work of the people who come to a meeting on Wednesday night. The 10. This is the work of everybody who's here because you've received the gospel, you've received the food, you've received the formation. Divide yourselves up into groups and at least in 5 minutes decide what are you going to do this week to try to invite somebody who's not here. Because the fact is, we the clergy, the whole point of the new evangelization and the teaching really of the fruition of the Second Vatican Council is, it is the work of the church, which is us, folks. It's us. It's not us and them guys, the clergy guys, they do that sort of stuff. The sisters, they do that sort of stuff. It's us. And we're here at Mass because we think it's important. I'm just using this as an example. We think it's important. So divide yourselves up into groups for 5 minutes after Mass and decide what you're going to do. Or try this for a question to ask somebody. How many of your parishioners live on your block? And maybe you can meet as a block. I'm not asking you to go to China. I'm asking you to go see who's across the street. And if they were ever Catholic. Because given the modern statistics, chances are if they're not going to Mass, at some point they were. And ask them, invite them. Hey, look, it's me, and we have like 3 other families here. We go to Mass over here. You're welcome to come with us. If you don't have a way, you see, it's got to be. It's not about another program so much. It's not about another document that gets issued. It's about the fact that people have an eye for noticing who on my block really isn't here. And at least issue the invitation. Jesus issued the invitation. Not everybody stayed, not everybody went, but at least they issued the invitation. Because that's an expression of a genuine concern, this sense of love. Now, I'm going to get back to that but I want to make this emphasizing point that it is the work. Now, I know the statistics. You know, Mass attendance in the Mass in the United States is down to how many percentages since 1965? I don't know. I only deal so much with statistics because statistics, God does not deal in statistics. He had 12 apostles, and they talked to people. In a certain way, we have a lot more than 12 apostles. Maybe we don't have as many as we think we ought to have, or maybe we used to have, or maybe we should have, or maybe it's not because it's their fault that we don't have. None of that. We have more than 12 apostles. And the least we can do is figure out who on our block was Catholic at some time, and for some reason doesn't feel that they have a place there anymore. That's the new evangelization. It's the eyes of a Catholic who wonders who's not here. And maybe they're not here because they can't get there. Maybe they're not here because of difficulties of age or infirmity or whatever it is. You know, I used to talk to, when I was a pastor in Corpus Christi, I used to call them the white-robed army of extraordinary ministers. We had more extraordinary ministers, and they did great work of assisting with the communion at Masses at the cathedral there. It's a beautiful church. And I would say to them as a group, you need to go to the nursing home and take communion to the sick. And many of them did, and it was heroic. But many of them said, I just can't. It's too hard. I know it's hard. But in the language of the gospel, that's one of the reasons to try to do it. Because it's hard for you to go and witness that particular experience that someone is living in life. Imagine how hard is that person to know that nobody wants to come see them and take them Holy Communion. It's person to person. It's amazing. You go take Holy Communion to a nursing home, and you're liable to run into the niece one of these Sundays or one of these Thursdays or whenever you go, First Friday. You're liable to run into the niece or the nephew who hasn't been to Mass in 10 years. And the only thing that makes them think that they even want to continue to be Catholic is because Grandma still believes. And the church actually thinks it's important to make sure she knows she belongs, which is why we take communion. But again, it's hard. It's hard to do these things. Why? Because it's hard to step out of ourselves. I'll be real honest with you. People ask me, what is your happiest moment as a priest or as a bishop? And I always tell them, it's when I am leaving from having said Mass at the maximum security prison. Because it's a very hard thing to do. I'm happy when I'm leaving because I've always find it's a joyful experience. It's always something more of a surprise of grace than I ever would have anticipated. I'm also glad I'm done. But the fact is, the church needs to be there. Because sometimes we get the attitude, well, it's kind of their fault they're there anyway, right? Where is that in the gospel? And there's one thing Pope Francis is saying, is that the first response to a person, the first way we look at a person, talk about the eyes of the new evangelization that Francis is talking to us about, we don't look at them and decide in advance what their sins are. We look at them as persons loved by Christ. Because it's the world that wants to identify people according to categories. It is the church that wishes to identify people as children of the Father. We let the world decide for us what the categories are. And a lot of people feel categorized, and that's why they feel rejected. We say, you are a child of the Father. Come and meet his Son. And if you talk to him and you don't want to stay with him, okay. But at least talk to him. But if you find that he has something to say to you, introducing them to the Gospels, then stay a while. You are welcome to learn from him in our place. We can't let the world use its categories for us to kind of decide who deserves to hear the gospel announced. Because the first moment is announcing, calling people to recognize who Jesus is. He is at least here. And maybe in a world that is increasingly secularized, we would call it windswept in some ways, where there's hardly any stitch of remembrance of God in the public sphere. Okay, that's the world we live with. As John Paul would say, stop whining about it and do something. Live your life as a believer. And rejoice when you encounter another believer, even if they don't quite fit the perfect pattern. At least be happy. God's grace. Because one of the marks of us as believers exactly is this. The fact is that we all, aside from the categories of the world, which we do not embrace, we embrace the categories. We don't even speak of categories. We speak of the ways by which we are spoken of in our relationship to God. Who are we? We are a people who rely on God's mercy. That's who we are. All of us. There's not one of us in this room who can say, I do not need to rely on God's mercy. That's the great common denominator of the human race. That's what keeps us, in a certain sense, from being proud and triumphalistic in our Catholicism. We are always and constantly in need of God's mercy. That is who we are. we have been loved by God. And God's not done yet with me. See, we have to keep that in mind too. We announce the gospel, but somebody else will have to do the formation. Nobody can do everything. You invite somebody to come back, you're going to have to be able to hand them on to somebody else who will help to kind of get them to know Jesus. Help them to be able to become more aware of what the gospel itself really says. The content of the love of God is in the gospels. It is always exciting, but it's sometimes difficult. But the difficulty of the gospel makes no sense apart from the personal knowledge of the one who teaches it. Our principal responsibility in evangelization is to introduce someone to the Lord Jesus in the community of the church. And this is an important part. In the community of the church. One of the marks of our current culture is I love Jesus. It's the church I have a problem with. I've had people say that to me, and with a smile, but sometimes you have to say the thing at least the way you think it is. And I say, well, you know what that really means. I love Jesus, it's other people I have a problem with. Because the way the church works, it's a great thing. Is this different from apostolic movements and retreats where you get to go because you want to? The church, the only thing we all have in common is that we all want to be where Jesus is. And because of that fact, we sit next to each other in the pews. You can't control, usually, although we would like to, because, there are huggers around there. We would like to control who we sit next to, but we can't always. But that's the mark. To me, that's one of the signs of the divine origins of the church. You can't control who sits next to you, because Peter couldn't control where James sat either. Or where Matthew sat. Jesus didn't say, "Come to me, all of you who like each other." Now, let's just say this, because this is a problem, because people have a sense that the church ought to be a group of where everybody is close friends. And one of the things about Catholicism is it's so big. But I say, I think we have to say this. This is one of the marks of the reality of how Christ calls us. He calls us to form us into a people that have Him as the center. That's what it is to be the church. In a certain way, unless, and Jesus says this in the gospel, unless you love to learn one another, you can have no part of me. That's the gospel. To defend the importance of belonging to the church is not to defend something extraneous to the gospel. It is to defend the very essence of what it is that Jesus intended when He called people around Him in the first place. You must learn to love one another. That's one of the things that He tries to teach. In that sense, the parish is the best school of the gospel, because if there's anything I have ever learned in all my working with parishes is that one of the things we're constantly trying to learn is how to love one another in this place. People of different personalities, people of different character, people of different backgrounds, people of different languages, people of different priorities. And let's face it, sometimes we say to ourselves, it would be so much easier if I didn't have to deal with other people. But that is the issue. The church is not extraneous to the announcement. It has come to this place where the Jesus is the reason that we all are together, where He teaches us that even though we're very different, and we're on different parts of the road because God's not done with any of us yet, He is the reason we persevere in seeking to love one another. The act of charity with which I began this little reflection, as the one sign that is persuasive in the modern world, is exactly this community of people who have the one great thing in common. We are all in need of the mercy of Christ, and He's the one who teaches us and He forms us. We're no longer a crowd, we are a people. And He forms us, and He teaches us, and He feeds us, and He sends us. And He sends us, and He keeps sending us. And He sends us not necessarily to go on different paths, but just to walk the path of our everyday with an eye open for the fact that I'm being sent today. I really am. Because we've allowed the world to convince us that we do our church thing on Sunday and everything's fine. The world likes that. Keep your church thing on Sunday. We don't want to hear it during the week. Well, I'm not saying you have to start preaching on the street corners, although if you want to do that, there's a good place for it. But I am saying that we have to kind of recover our sense that the gospel is meant to encompass every moment, every day, and that we are a people sent, and we are sent so that we can ask the question, I haven't seen you in a long time. What happened? Oh, no, okay. No, nobody wants to do that because religion has become the most private thing. I mean, isn't it something, the culture we live in? It's so paradoxical. On television, they can talk about the most outlandish topics having to do with sexuality, but never talk about religion. That is the world we're living in. We can't let ourselves be categorized. To be a people sent when you go to work, when you go to school, when you have a... And I want to say two final, because I know time runs out. I've got more notes, but anyway, that's okay. A couple of things. Sometimes I think we rely too much on the Mass to be our principal evangelizing instrument. It was never meant to be that. The Mass is the culminating act by which the church is formed into a people sent, a people who receive, a people who are sent. But there's so many other things we could be doing in our parishes. I really think one of the things that talks about rediscovering in our Catholic tradition, we need to rediscover the local patronal feast as an important moment in the life of a parish. Because one of the things, again, taking my cue from Chesterton, we're the ones who know how to throw a party, which means we enjoy life. Why? Because life is a great thing. Because what ultimately do we believe? We believe that love wins. In the end, that is the question the world is asking us, because the world is slowly dying in its belief that love in the end matters. It's a slow dying process, but we're watching it happen in front of our very eyes. And we have to be the ones who reaffirm. We believe in the end God wins because His love wins because Christ is risen. This is what we believe. And because we believe that in the end love wins, we are people of hope and we don't give up. Because hope is something that is deeply rooted in believing that God is the one who triumphs in love. And that's what we believe. And so, yes, life is tough and there are lots of problems. Nobody's denying that. We are very realistic. Christians can be the most and should be the most realistic of all. But we know how to throw a party because in the end, life wins, and heaven is a banquet where we rejoice in the fact that the victory belongs to love. This is what we believe. What does St. John say in his letter? We have believed not that we have loved God, but that He has loved us. This we believe, and we believe in the triumph of that love. That is why patronal feasts, particular feasts that are important to the local community, to the local culture, whether it's Our Lady of Guadalupe or the Immaculate Conception, whatever it is. But invite, if the invited will not come, then go to the highways and the byways and bring them and say, I don't care if you're a believer or not, but we're going to have great tacos that night. Because that's the point of the parable. I remember there was one time when I was a rector of the cathedral, and I had, the Knights of Columbus, and I had the Ultra Society, all the societies who always planned the parish festival, and there erupted in my very presence a huge argument over who's going to control the dunking booth. Well, we made more money last year, so we'll do it again. But then no, it's our turn because you told us last. And I finally said, look, the object of our festival is, I hope we make a little money, but that's not the object of our festival. The object of our festival is to get people together to enjoy the fact that we are believers and life is great because we have been redeemed. And so you can laugh and you can tell a good joke and you can throw a tennis ball to dunk farther into the pool. That's okay. But I think our festivals, slowly we have let
the deepest elements of our Catholic cultures, which have roots in Latin America or in Europe or in other parts of the world, the feast day, the procession, where you took out the statue. One of my finest, happiest days in Brownsville is under the dedication of the Immaculate Conception. It's when the Immaculate Conception Cathedral, we traipsed through the town of Brownsville with the statue, and we're all singing. And most of the people who aren't there are looking out the windows, and they're believers. They just haven't been to Mass in a long time. And it's good to remind them, well, we're still here, and you're welcome to join us. Because so much of our new evangelization is saying to people who are not with us anymore, we're still here. And if you find it difficult to believe that love in the end wins, then come back to us. Because faith in Christ, crucified and risen, is the only thing that sustains a people in the hope that we have in the beauty and goodness of life. Folks, throw a great party in your local parishes. Thank you very much.